This is Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, Chapter 27. This chapter is called The Doctor. The next morning, Mr. Fitzgibbon started the larger of his two tractors. The huge one he kept in the barn, the one that pulled the combine in the fall harvest. With help from Paul and Billy, he bolted the big bulldozer blade to the front of it, rumbled it up through the barnyard gate, and stopped it near the rose bush. "We'll wait till they come," he said, turning off the engine. Mrs. Frisby could not bear to watch, and yet, even more, she could not bear not to watch. She knew there was nothing to be gained by it, nothing she could do. Yet how could she stay at home when the 10 rats, including Justin and Brutus, were waiting bravely underground? She could not. She thought at first of her watch hole in the corner post, then she decided against it. Nearer to the rose bush, on the edge of the woods, stood a hickory tree, its scaly bark like a ladder inviting her to climb. 10 feet up in this tree, a large branch jutted straight out. On this branch, up close to the trunk, she had a vantage point from which, herself unseen, she could look down on the rose bush and also see the woods to a blackberry bramble there. Though she'd never been in it, she was sure the rat's exit must be near it. She settled down to wait. It was a chilly morning with a damp breeze and a gray mist that blew by in patches. Somewhere near the middle of the morning, a square white truck came into the driveway. It went first to the house. A man in white overall uniform climbed out and knocked on the Fitzgibbons' door. It was too far away for Mrs. Frisby to hear the knock, or hear what the man had said when Mrs. Fitzgibbon came out on the porch. But 10 seconds later, Billy ran from the house to the barn where Mr. Fitzgibbon was working. The man returned to the truck and waited, standing outside the open cab door. Through the windshield, she could see that 2 more men sat in the front seat, and that one of them wore horn-rimmed glasses. Now Mr. Fitzgibbon approached the truck, Billy dancing beside him, apparently in excitement. There was a conference, none of which Mrs. Frisby could hear, accompanied by gestures towards the rose bush and the waiting bulldozer. The man in white climbed back into the driver's seat and drove the truck across the grass. He backed up beside the bulldozer, stopping perhaps 10 feet away from the bush. Mrs. Frisby stared at it. If there was anything printed on it, it must be on the other side, away from her. Then 3 men climbed out, and she could hear what they said. "It's a big one, all right," said one of the men. "And look at those thorns. It's hard to see how even a rat could get in there." The man in the horn-rimmed glasses walked around the edge of the bush, examining it closely. He bent over. "Look at this," he said. "There's an entrance hole, very neatly hidden. And look behind it, a path leading straight in." He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had walked up with Billy. "You are right. You'll need to bulldoze it. It would take us all day to hack our way in there. But cut it off just at the surface if you can. If you dig too deep and open the hole, they'll get away," he added. "You better tell the boy to keep back. We're using cyanide, and it's dangerous." Billy, after some argument, was dispatched to the back porch, where Mrs. Fitzgibbon was also watching. One of the men had walked to the far side of the bush, near the side of Mrs. Frisby's tree. "Doc," he called, "here's another entrance in the bush, and there's a hole just inside it." Doc was the man in the horn-rimmed glasses. He was a doctor. Mrs. Frisby thought, Doctor somebody, and he was in charge. "Can you get at it?" he asked. "Not very well, too many thorns." The man, who was a doctor, walked around and looked at it. "No," he said. "Anyway, that would be an escape hatch. We'll find the main hole nearer to the middle of the bush." He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had mounted the tractor. "Okay," said the doctor. "Can you push it that way, away from the shed?" Mr. Fitzgibbon nodded, and the motor started with a roar. He pulled the lever and flexed a heavy steel blade up and down, bringing the bottom of the edge to rest even with the ground. The blade was fully 8 inches across. He pulled another lever. The wheels, with cleated tires as tall as windows, dug in, and the blade scraped forward. The bush fought back, then yielded angrily, snapping and crackling before the inexorable thrust of steel. A single sweep, and a third of it lay, writhing heap of thorns, in a pile 20 feet away. The ground trembled under the wheels, and Mrs. Frisby thought of the hidden rats huddled below. Supposing the weight collapsed the earth, caved in the storage room, and trapped them. Another sweep, and a third. Only a thorny stubble now stood where the bush had been. On the porch, Mrs. Fitzgibbon covered her eyes with her hands, and Billy cheered in excitement. Plainly exposed were two holes, simple, round rat holes. There was no trace of the small mound, nor the elegant arched entrance. Arthur had done his work thoroughly. Mrs. Frisby wondered for a moment at the second hole. Then she remembered his saying, "We'll give it another rear exit to lock." Of course, they dug another hole. Most likely, she thought, a dummy, leading nowhere. The men in the white suits went to action. The back doors of the truck were opened and a long, flexible pipe unrolled. It looked like a fire hose, except at the end, instead of a nozzle, there was a round plunger, like a big rubber ball cut in half. One of the men donned the mask with a glass visor and a tube that ran back to his and a tube that ran to a pack on his back. It was a gas mask. The masked man pulled a hose over to the center of the rat hole and pressed the plunger over it, covering it completely. From the back of the truck, the other two took a large box made of wood and wire, almost a yard wide, and placed it over the second hole. It was a cage, but half of its bottom was a trap door, neatly mounted on the hinges. This they raised, placing open the part directly over the opening in the earth. Then they backed away, one of them holding a trip cord, which would close the trap door after the rats were inside. "All set?" the doctor called to the man in the mask. The mask nodded. "Keep back now," said the doctor to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had left the tractor to watch. He walked to the truck, reached inside, and turned a switch. Mrs. Frisby heard the soft throb of a pump. Now. She turned and watched the blackberry bramble in the woods. Would they hear the pump? Where were they? Oh, please let them get out. Almost a minute passed. The men in white watched the trap. Nothing moved. Then she saw it. Behind the bramble, half hidden by a swirl of mist, a gray-brown shape. A rat, shaking dirt from his ears. Another. Then three more. They huddled in silence, waiting. More. How many? 10? No. 7. Only 7. Where were the other 3? Still they waited. Then, as if by agreement, they stopped waiting. They ran. All 7 of them. Not back into the woods to safety, but out of the woods, towards the stubble of the rose bush, and towards the men. At the edge of the bush they stopped as if in confusion, ran to the left, to the right, then fled back to the woods again. Now they were out of sight of the men, but not out of Mrs. Frisby's sight. Instantly they regrouped behind the blackberry bramble and charged out again, but this time in smaller numbers. First 2, then 3, then 2 again. She saw what they were up to. They were not in the least bit confused. They were making 7 rats look like 20 rats, or 40, a steady stream of them. In the mist and the hectic running, turning, hiding, she could not tell whether she recognized any of them. The men shouted, "Look at that! A whole pack of 'em! How'd they get out? Get to the nests! Get the nets!" The doctor turned off the pump, and the man with the hose pulled off his mask. As a new wave of rats danced along the edge of the clearing, all 3 men ran to the truck, and from it pulled long-handled nets. But Mrs. Frisby, up in her branch, was staring at the blackberry bush again. She saw something that all of the others, including the rats, did not see. An 8th rat had come out. He emerged running, but then stumbled, and he got up and ran again, this time more slowly, circling vaguely to the right. He did not seem to know where he was going. He reached a spruce thicket of saplings almost out of her sight, and there, abruptly, he fell over on his side and lay still. Meanwhile, all 3 men, holding their nets low, ran across the stubble towards the parade of rats. But as they approached the parade, it vanished. The rats, their purpose accomplished, melted into the misty woods, and this time they did not reappear. Mrs. Frisby watched them as they walked swiftly away in single file and disappeared from her view, back into the deep forest and up the mountainside. The rear guard was gone, bound for Thorn Valley. But the eighth rat still lay unmoving among the saplings, and two had never come out at all. "They're gone," said the man who wore the mask. "They fooled us." "What happened?" asked Mr. Fitzgibbon, standing near the truck. "Simple enough," said the doctor. "They had two escape holes, and they used the other one." He walked back to the blackberry bramble and bent down, kicking the branches aside with his foot. "Here it is," he said. "Quite a long tunnel. One of the longest I've seen." To the other two men he said, "Get the pick and the shovels." For half an hour they dug, laying open a narrow trench along the tunnel. From her angle of view in the tree, Mrs. Frisby could only see the top of the trench, but not down to the bottom. Still she watched, saying to herself, perhaps, after all, there were only 8. Maybe they decided that 8 would be enough. Then one of the shovels broke through the air. They'd come to the rat storage room. "There's 2 of 'em," said one of the men, and her heart sank. Who were they? She wanted to run and look, but she didn't dare. "Careful," said the doctor. "There may still be some gas in there. Let the wind blow it out." "Oof," said one of the men. "That's not gas, that's garbage." "Open it up a little more," said the doctor. One of the men wielded a shovel for another minute, and then the doctor peered in. "Garbage," he said. "Last night's dinner. Garbage and 2 dead rats." Mrs. Frisby thought, "He sounds disappointed." "Only 2," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Yeah, it's easy to see what happened. A hole this size would have been a couple dozen at least. But these 2 must have been up the front, near the tunnel. They got a whiff of the gas, and it killed them, but before they died they must have warned the others so the rest could run out." "Warned them?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Could they do that?" "Yes," said the doctor. "They're intelligent animals. Some can do a great deal more than that." But he didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned to one of the men. "We might as well take these 2 back with us." From the truck, the man produced a white paper sack and a pair of plastic gloves. He pulled the gloves on, reached into the hole, and placed 2 dead rats into the sack. He did this with his back to Mrs. Frisby, so she never even got a glimpse of them. "All right," said the doctor. "Let's close it up." They shoveled the dirt back into the trench and returned to the truck. "You'll let me know if they have rabies?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Rabies?" said the doctor. "Oh, yes, of course, but I doubt it. They look perfectly healthy." Perfectly healthy, thought Mrs. Frisby sadly, except for being dead. She looked in the woods, towards the saplings where the other rat lay. Was he, too, now dead? To her surprise, she saw that he was moving. Or was he? In the mist it was hard to tell, but something had moved. After the truck had left, Mr. Fitzgibbon stood looking at the ruin of the rosebush. He seemed vaguely puzzled and disappointed. He must be wondering, she thought, whether it had been worth it, just to exterminate 2 rats. He had no way of knowing, of course, that the rest had also gone and would not return, that his grain loft was safe. In a moment he turned and walked to the house. As soon as he was safely gone, Mrs. Frisby scurried down from her tree and into the woods. On the ground she could no longer see the rat or the thicket where he lay, but she knew the direction, and so she ran. Around the stump, over a mound of leaves, past a cedar tree. They were saplings, and there lay the rat, still on his side. It was Brutus. Beside him, furtively trying to move him, stood Mr. Ages. She reached him, breathless from her run. "Is he dead?" "No, he's unconscious. But he's alive and breathing. I think he'll revive if I could just get him to swallow this." Mr. Ages indicated a small corked bottle, no bigger than a thimble, on the ground beside him. "What is it?" "It's an antidote for the poison. We thought this might happen, so we got it ready last night. He just got a little of the gas, made it this far, then collapsed. Help me lift his head." Mr. Ages had been unable to lift Brutus's head and the bottle at the same time. Now, with Mrs. Frisby's help, he forced open Brutus's mouth and poured in just a few drops of the smoky liquid that the bottle contained. In a few seconds Brutus made a gulping noise, swallowed hard, and then spoke. "It's dark," he said. "I can't see." "Open your eyes," said Mr. Ages. Brutus opened them and looked around. "I'm out," he said. "How how did I get here?" "You don't remember?" "No, wait. Yes. I was in the hole. I smelled gas, an awful, choking, sweet smell. I tried to run, but I stumbled over somebody lying on the floor, and I fell down. I must have breathed in some of the gas, and I couldn't get up. And then I heard others running past me. I couldn't see them. It was darker than night. One of them ran into me, stopped. He pulled me up, and I tried to run again, but I was too dizzy. I kept falling. The other one helped me up again, and I went a few steps more. He kept pulling me, then pushing, and somehow I finally got to the end of the tunnel. I saw daylight, and the air smelled better, but there was nobody else there. I thought the others must have left, so I ran a little farther, and that's all I remember," Mrs. Frisby said. "And what about the one who helped you?" "I don't know who it was. I couldn't see, and he didn't speak at all. I suppose he was trying to hold his breath. When we got near the end, I could see daylight. He gave me one last shove towards it and then turned back." "He went back?" "Yes, you see, there was still one rat back there, the one I stumbled over. I think he went back to help that one." "Whoever he was," said Mrs. Frisby, "he never came out. He died in there." "Whoever he was," said Mr. Ages, "he was brave."